The reading is taken from Exodus 24, which is page 82 in the Church Bibles. The covenant confirmed. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel. You are to worship at a distance, but Moses alone is to approach the Lord. The others must not come near, and the people may not come up with him." When Moses went and told the people all the Lord's words and laws, they responded with one voice, "Everything the Lord has said we will do." Moses then wrote down everything the Lord had said. He got up early the next morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and set up 12 stone pillars representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Then he sent young Israelite men, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as fellowship offerings to the Lord. Moses took half of the blood and put it in bowls, and the other half he splashed against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and said to the people, and read it to the people. They responded, "We will do everything the Lord has said, and we will obey." Moses then took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, "This is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel went up and saw the God of Israel. Under his feet was something like a pavement made of lapis lazuli, as bright blue as the sky. But God did not raise his hand against these leaders of Israel. They saw God, and they ate and drank. The Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and stay here, and I will give you tablets of stone with the law and commandments I have written for their instruction." Then Moses set out with Joshua, his assistant, and Moses went up on the mountain of God. He said to the elders, "Wait here for us until we come back to you. Aaron and Hur are with you, and anyone involved in a dispute can go to them." When Moses went up on the mountain, the cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai. For 6 days the cloud covered the mountain, and on the 7th day the Lord called to Moses from within the cloud. To the Israelites the glory of the Lord looked like a consuming fire on top of the mountain. Then Moses entered the cloud as he went up the mountain, and he stayed on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights.
Thank you very much, Jessica, for that reading. We're going to explore it together, so great if you can keep it open in front of you. My name's John Risbridger. I'm one of the ministers here. So in case you hadn't noticed, the moment everyone has been waiting for has arrived. The text of an outline agreement has been accepted by the key players in the conversation. The whole basis for a new relationship written down. The question now is whether it will be accepted by the wider community when they get their say. Sometimes a week doesn't just seem like a long time in politics, it can seem like an eternity, can't it? But what a week it's been. But actually, in those first couple of sentences of what I've said, I wasn't talking about Brexit. I wasn't talking about Westminster. I wasn't talking about the EU. I was talking about Exodus 24, the passage that has just been read to us, although the parallels are striking. Let me just try and explain briefly. The book of Exodus that we've been going through as a whole church across the age groups over this term. This book tells the story of how God had rescued the ancient Israelite nation from their slavery in Egypt and brought them out into the desert where he would establish his relationship with them as his people before he led them on into the land of Canaan, the promised land. And where we land in Exodus 24 is that moment where he's establishing his relationship with them, the relationship between God and his people. The last 4 chapters, including chapter 20 that we looked at last week, are like the text setting out the basis for that relationship. And when we get to chapter 24, we've reached that moment where the whole thing is to be put to the people and to their representatives to secure their agreement. And to cut to the chase, what happens here is summarized for us in verse 7, where Moses took the book of the covenant, that's the text, read it to the people, and they responded, "We will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey." The deal is on. The commitment is made. The wording has been accepted. Now, we need to step back a few steps to kind of understand this a little bit more. But before we do, why should we bother wanting to understand this? Is this really a piece of very vaguely interesting ancient history? Or is this actually relevant to your life and to mine? Well, to answer that question, let me introduce you to Ellie, who's often here on a Sunday. I met Ellie just over a year ago. She's a lovely, intelligent person. She's got a good job. She's a pharmacist. But when I first met Ellie, she was looking for some bigger answers in life. What is life all about? Where can it get its significance and direction from? Ellie was not a Christian, not really from a Christian background, but she had this nagging question in her mind as to whether if she explored a bit more about God, might she start to find some answers for her life? And so she came along to church. She met Ruth Berryman, who was really friendly and welcomed her. And she ended up signing up for the Alpha course. And we were leading the course. And I watched as Ellie gradually discovered some news that she never expected. The news that the God of heaven is not some miserable old man in the sky barking laws at us all the time to try and mess up our lives and spoil our fun, but rather that he is the God of immense and generous love and kindness, who invites us to know him, to live in relationship with him as his friends through his son Jesus. That's what Ellie was slowly discovering as she went through the Alpha course. And as she began to respond to what she heard, she began to discover the joy of that relationship for herself. Since she began that relationship with God through Jesus, Ellie's life has had quite a lot of challenges. It hasn't all been easy, but that relationship with God has remained with her, and it's still growing to this day. It's an amazing thing to see a person come into relationship with God and find their lives changed through that experience. This coming Sunday, I think it's already been mentioned probably in the notices, we've got Camille from Heart for Lebanon coming to speak to us. And I had the privilege of spending a week looking at his work a few years ago. And it is absolutely incredible to see someone who's discovered a relationship with God through Jesus and seeing how it's completely transformed his life and is overflowing to impact the Syrian refugees living in his country, of which there are so many. It's the most amazing story. If you can possibly be there next Saturday morning, you really should. Don't miss out. It's fantastic what God has done there. And Camille's story and Ellie's story is why this passage is relevant to us. Because this relationship with God that is made possible back here in Exodus 24 and that Ellie and Camille have discovered, this is ultimately the relationship for which we were made. This is the relationship that can bring meaning and direction and joy to our lives. And here in this passage, we begin to see how that relationship can be made, how it can be part of our experience, and what will happen in our lives when we live in that relationship. Let me first of all give you a technical word that may help us. It's the word covenant, and it's quite a big word in the Bible. Actually, it's a simple idea. A covenant is just a binding agreement between two parties, sometimes nations, sometimes individuals, based on solemn promises. It's a little bit like a contract, but it's more like a marriage because it's not just legal, it's relational as well, a covenant. And covenants were things in the ancient world. There were lots of covenants made in the ancient worlds. And here, according to verse 8 of the passage, God is making a covenant, an agreement between himself and his people, the young nation of Israel. Let's have a look first at the text of the covenant, the deal, if you like. First of all, here's a picture. Here is a picture of the front page of the text that's been agreed, at least to some degree, during this past week. The first one is the front page of the withdrawal agreement of the UK from the EU, and the second is the front page of the declaration about the future relationship. Yes, it really does look as boring as that, okay? But the text of the covenant that God was making with Israel is also written down. And it's written down for us in chapters 20 to 23. And you can go away and read those at your leisure if you like. These kind of deals, these covenants in the ancient world, they generally followed a fairly standard pattern. First of all, the two parties would be introduced, a little bit about the history that's brought the two together. Then there's a whole lot of sections about what it will mean for the two to live together. In this case, what will it mean for Israel to live under the authority of the Lord Yahweh as their king? And then finally, what if they do and what if they don't? So that was standard fare. That's how these covenants worked. And that's what you've got here in these chapters. But if you actually read them through, and it's a good idea to read them through, what you'll find is that most of the text is taken up with laws which Israel was expected to keep. Now, last week we saw that the laws were not there to make them God's people. And that's really, really important because so many people think that's how it works. If you want to be accepted by God, he sets the rules, you keep the rules, and he says, okay, I'll accept you. That isn't how it works. It didn't work that way here. God had already accepted them as his people. He'd already made the first move towards them. The purpose of the laws was to help them figure out what it meant to live as God's people. That's really, really important. But actually, if you do take the time to sit down and read through these chapters, it isn't going to be the most fun kind of quiet time you've ever had. Because actually, it's going to raise all kinds of knotty problems for you. Let me just tell you one or two of them. Why, for example, do the male slaves get released after 7 years, while the female slaves apparently don't? That's tricky. There are answers. Ask me afterwards if you want, but it's tricky. Actually, why are there slaves at all? You'd think there wouldn't be slaves, wouldn't you, if God was setting the laws? And why is there a death penalty? Does that mean we have to have a death penalty? And perhaps most famous of all, why can't you cook a goat in its mother's milk? If you like goat milk and you fancy it cooked in milk, what's the problem? But there's a law against it. Do you see, this isn't actually very easy to understand. Now, you're going to be relieved to know I don't have time this morning to give you answers to all of the problems that are here, but I am going to very quickly give you 5 pointers that might just help if you do read them through. Number one, when God speaks here, he's not just dealing in abstract moral principles. He's dealing in day-to-day concrete reality for people who live at a particular time, in a particular context, in a particular economy, and a particular culture. He's speaking into their day-to-day reality. Number two, as he does that, the underlying question is this. Not how can God's people be taken out of their world into an ideal universe over here, but how can they live within that world, within that economy, within that context, in a way that will reflect the goodness of God right there and then. So number three, the really interesting thing to help us understand what's going on here is to compare what God says in this text, chapters 20 to 23, with what gets said in similar texts from the same time and the same culture. And the scholars have done that. And when you look at those other texts from the ancient world, what you discover is, yes, this is a world where bonded labor or slavery is part of the economy, A world where fathers would make choices for their daughters. A world where property was mainly to do with agriculture and the land. A world where the death penalty was routinely applied. And a world where paganism was everywhere. That's the world into which God was speaking to his people. Now, when you see it in that context and read through these chapters against that background, actually what you find, number 4, is that these laws are remarkably progressive. Because though slavery is not immediately abolished, the whole economy would have fallen apart if it had been, nonetheless, the rights of slaves are carefully protected here. And yes, the death penalty continues. It was routine. But penalties that mutilate the body, and there were lots of those in the other texts from the time, there's none of those here. Intriguingly, the rights of aliens and refugees and foreigners are carefully protected in these laws. Interesting, because of course, only a few months before, Israel had been aliens, refugees, and foreigners in Egypt. And now God's saying, okay, when you have people that come into your community in that situation, you mustn't oppress them. You've got to look after them and safeguard them. And look on further and you'll find that there are basic property rights that protect the poor against the abuses of potentially the wealthy. And the courts are protected against the kind of corruption that will deprive the poor people of justice. And even the land itself is protected from over-intensive agriculture. There's an ecological dimension to these laws. Actually, in their context, these are remarkably progressive laws. And then the final thing to say is that some of the more obscure laws, like the one about not cooking a goat in its mother's milk, are probably there to outlaw pagan practices from the worship of Israel, because God wanted to them to worship him in a pure, undiluted way. So there's just a few thoughts about the text. Let's move from the detail onto the moment that Exodus 24 describes, the moment of commitment. The text is all there. Now's the question, will the people commit? So imagine, going back to our Brexit illustration, that moment when all the haggling is over. I hear a big sigh of relief. Won't it be wonderful when all the haggling, well, actually, it may or may not be, depending on your perspective. But anyway, imagine that moment when the haggling is over and the Prime Minister goes to Brussels to sign the whole thing off with the other EU heads of state. This is that kind of moment envisaged at the beginning of chapter 24, where Moses, his brother Aaron, and his 2 oldest sons, and then 70 elders, that's kind of like the MPs, the representatives of the people, they're all invited to go up onto the mountain to meet with God in order for the deal to be kind of signed off. But before that happens, Moses needs to know what he's going to say to God when he gets there. God has given them the text. What do the people say? A bit like the Prime Minister needs to go to Parliament first before she goes back to Brussels to see what the people say. So, verses 3 and 4, Moses communicates everything God has said to the people, and they respond. End of verse 3, everything the Lord has said, we will do. Deal on. But of course, the problem is words are too easy, aren't they? Words are sometimes cheap. If Israel is going to come into this special covenant relationship with God, it's going to need more than just words, just good intentions that easily evaporate over breakfast the next morning. It needs something else. And what it needs, this is perhaps a surprise, it needs blood. The blood of sacrifice. Let me try and explain. I was talking the other day to someone in the church who did his PhD on this book, the book of Exodus. And he told me there's one question that runs all the way through the book, actually really all the way through the Old Testament. Here is the question: how is a God who is perfect, or we might use the word holy, how is the God who is perfect going to live in relationship with people who are not perfect? We might use the word who are sinful, messed up, rebellious, like me, like all of us here. How's it going to happen for this perfect God to live with imperfect people. And the answer that Exodus and the rest of the Bible gives is not rules, because rules don't work. Giving a whole set of rules to make us a little bit better people until eventually we're good enough for God to accept us, it doesn't work, because we actually don't obey the rules, not even our own rules, let alone God's rules. No, rules are not the answer. The answer instead is sacrifice. In this case, the sacrifice of animals whose lives were given in place of the people. Now, that needs a bit of explanation. Let me very quickly try and explain. You and I were created to live life with God at the center. That was the life for which he made us. But instead of doing that, we pushed God away and put ourselves in his place. We usurped his authority and began to live self-centered lives rather than the God-centered lives that he created us for. And in doing that, we rejected the life he made us for and turned the whole order of his creation upside down. And for that, we deserve to die because we've rejected the life he made us for. But the idea of the sacrifice is that the animal dies in our place instead of us, paying for us the death penalty that we deserve so that we can be forgiven and live our lives as cleaned up people because someone has died for us. That was especially the thinking behind what's called in verse 5 the burnt offering. But then there were also other offerings made, other sacrifices called fellowship offerings, which were more like a kind of thank you to God. Thank you for bringing us into this relationship with yourself. So in verse 5 here, the offerings are made. Again, in verses 6 and 7, the people promise to obey what God has asked of them. And then the blood from the sacrifices is sprinkled onto the altar where the animals have been sacrificed, and then sprinkled onto the people, because that's saying these belong to God. The altar is there to make sacrifices to God. But the people too belong to God. They're coming into covenant relationship with God as his people. What happens next? Well, there's this moment of extraordinary encounter. Moses and the representatives of the people go partway up the mountain. Let's pick it up in verse 10. They went up and saw the God of Israel. Under his feet was something like a pavement made of lapis lazuli, that's like a blue precious stone, as bright blue as the sky. But God did not raise his hand against these leaders of the Israelites. They saw God. Now, that's a huge big deal in the Bible, because the general understanding in the Bible is that human beings cannot see God and survive the experience. He is far too holy, too pure, burningly pure, so that when all the rubbish that's in my heart gets into his presence, it's consumed. You can't see God and live. Not normally. But these people do see God and live. And God doesn't break out against them. Why? Because he has brought them into covenant relationship with himself. The sacrifices have been offered. The mess has been dealt with. They are free to encounter the living God in all his majesty and beauty. But did you notice I didn't actually finish verse 11 when I was reading it? There's an extra little phrase on the end. Let's pick that one up quickly. End of verse 11. They saw God and they ate and drank. The banquet. The banquet. Just to go back to Brexit again for a moment. Imagine that moment where finally everything is sorted, all the deals are signed, and it's time for the Prime Minister to go to Brussels, stand with Michel Barnier, kiss and make up over a nice glass of Beaujolais. Can you imagine that moment? They eat and drink together because they're friends again. Well, this is that kind of moment. Or to give another kind of illustration, imagine Prince Harry, and Meghan are in town. And if you're a royalist, you go along and you see them. That's pretty good, isn't it? If you're a royalist, to go and see Harry and Meghan. Don't seem to be many royalists here this morning. Anyway, just imagine, okay? But look, it's one thing to see them, but imagine you do go and see them, and then they pick you out of the crowd, and they say, hey, really nice to see you. We booked a table at the Cowherds this evening. Would you come and have supper with us? That's amazing. That's a completely different kind of cool, isn't it? Because to eat at someone's table is to be accepted as their friends. And that's what it meant for these ancient Israelites to be in covenant relationship with God. They were sitting at his table. They were eating and drinking. They were accepted as his people, his friends. And today, thousands of years on, God is still calling people into covenant relationship with himself and inviting them to eat at his table, to be his friends. Because in Jesus Christ, his Son, God has entered human history. And he's come to us with an invitation not to learn a book of rules and try and make ourselves better people, but an invitation to a relationship with a person whom we are called to follow, Jesus. We are invited to make that commitment to be his disciples, learning from him, following him, submitting to him, giving our lives to his amazing, thrilling, stretching, life-giving, world-transforming plans for us. That relationship is possible because he poured out his blood for us on the cross. See, yes, our lives, just like the lives of those ancient Israelites, our lives are messed up. There's so much in them that is spoiled. We deserve to die eternally, to be separated from God forever. But Jesus died for us on the cross, paying the penalty we could never pay, so that we could be forgiven, embraced, brought back home. And so this Jesus invites us to encounter him for ourselves, to live our lives in transforming relationship with him. Not only that, he invites us to sit at his table and eat with him. He invites us to his banquet, to be his friends. He's inviting us to do that today as he says, come to my table, remember what I've done on the cross, eat, drink, celebrate, receive all that I have done for you. He invites us to do it every day as we live our lives in friendship with him and follow him in the day-to-day realities of each day. And he invites us to do that eternally. As he invites us to the great banquet, which is eternal life in the new creation, where we will live with Jesus in perfect intimacy, unending satisfaction, and complete unspoiled joy. The banquet, life as it's meant to be, life in friendship with God. So I want to ask you this morning, are you living in that covenant relationship with God which Jesus died to make possible? Have you made that commitment? Say yes to Jesus. I'm going to follow you. I want to be your disciple. Have you asked him to deal with the mess in your heart and life through his sacrifice on the cross? Have you come to know him? Are you living your life as his friend, eating at his table, living in relationship with him? Because that's what he invites us to. And it's that he's inviting every one of us to this morning. And he's inviting you this morning. I want to make it personal. The invitation card is in your hands. Now, what do you say? How will you respond? Will you push him away and continue with life without him? Or will you say yes and begin the rest of your life with him? So I invite you this morning, come, make the commitment, receive his forgiveness, begin the adventure. Come, eat at his table, live your life in friendship with God. Lamre is going to lead us as we prepare for communion. Thank you, Lamre.